but it was the relationship that we began between the two of us, and it was to build upon the sermon that I spoke about, based upon relationships. He actually took the initiative, called me, said, let's go out for lunch. We went out for lunch. I called him. I had to reciprocate. Let's go out for lunch. Back and forth lunches for years. It's why I gained so much weight. But then as that relationship developed, it then expanded into our relationship between Beth Orr and St. Thomas. And so I am grateful to him, and I'm grateful to the church for welcoming me. It never ceases to amaze me that you have a Jew, a rabbi, speaking the word in a Christian institution immediately before the Eucharist. And so I am honored, and I really mean that from the bottom of my heart, and I feel profoundly grateful and very, very welcome. I would like to just give a shout out, if you don't mind, and I would love it if you would welcome them, to two of my congregants who are here, just to kind of keep me honest, I guess. Sussy Harris and Bob Rosen, who have worshiped with you. They're here to support me, and it means a great deal that you're here. So I apologize to them in advance, because what I'm going to present to you this morning is a rework of something that I shared with my congregation in the form of a sermon on Yom Kippur, which is the holiest day of the year. And it just so happens that I was listening on NPR, which is where I get a fair amount of my news these days, and there was a program called... what was it called? I'm blanking out on the name of it. But they introduced me to a character who I had never heard of, and his name was Fritz Haber. And I'd like to teach you who this man was, because my guess is no one's ever heard of him. Just by a show of hands, how many have ever heard of Fritz Haber? One person. Okay. So I'd like to talk about the complexity of his life and the moral lessons that I think we can draw from it. He was a man who was singularly responsible for feeding billions of people today. In fact, 2 out of 5 billion people on this planet are fed because of Fritz Haber. He was born in Prussia, 1868, to a respected Jewish family. Studied chemistry, and in 1891 received his doctorate. Between 1894 and 1911, he worked with a chemist, Karl Bosch, who developed what was called the Haber-Bosch process. It was a groundbreaking invention that synthesized ammonia from hydrogen, ammonia from hydrogen in water and the nitrogen from air. So ammonia is a combination of hydrogen and nitrogen. Now ammonia is the main ingredient in fertilization. Before Fritz Haber, there was no cheap way to create ammonia. And the problem with food production 100 years ago was not one of distribution as it is today. The problem in Haber's time was the limitations of agriculture to produce enough food to feed a growing world population. Haber's process made it possible to create massive amounts of fertilizer, which in turn increased the Earth's yield, which ultimately fed more people. His invention of fertilizer made it possible to feed billions of people today. Fritz Haber was a hero, is a hero. Now, his life gets a little bit more complicated. In 1918, he won the Nobel Prize in chemistry. But I want to talk about his work in World War I. Remember, I want to remind you, he was a chemist. As a result of his work with chemistry, nitrogen, and others, he became known as, and I quote, the father of chemical warfare. After World War I broke out, Haber became the head of the chemistry section of the German Ministry of War. At that time, he also converted from Judaism to Lutheranism. We're not 100% sure why, but we suspect it was because of increased anti-Semitism at that time, and he wanted to get a better academic position. Haber was also a patriotic German. He was deeply concerned during World War I about the stalemate of trench warfare and that Germany could lose the war if the war was protracted. So he led a team in developing chlorine gas to be used in enemy trench warfare. along with other deadly gases like mustard gas, invented by Fritz Haber. With mathematical and scientific certainty, he calculated how long it would take for mustard gas to kill a British or a Canadian soldier. His wife begged him not to introduce chemical warfare into war, but he refused, citing his German patriotism. His wife so much opposed his work that when he went to Ypres, Belgium, to introduce chemical warfare into the Allies' trenches, she took his service revolver and shot herself in the head. He continued to use gas in and throughout the war, and in 1921, he developed a cyanide gas formula which was used as an insecticide, especially as a fumigant in grain stores. Much more about that later. Facing increased anti-Semitism in the 1930s, he was, as I mentioned, a patriotic German. He realized that he could no longer stay in Germany, so in 1933, he left Germany and went to Great Britain, where he was rescued by scientists on that side, who ultimately were opposed to his work during World War I, but ultimately felt that the human need outweighed the politics at the time. So he ended up going to Great Britain, where he finally died at the age of 65 of heart failure in exile. So, Fritz Haber had saved billions of people from starvation, had gassed hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers during World War I. Now, if the story had ended here, it would have been enough, but it takes a horrible twist in World War II. His partner, Karl Bosch, of the Bosch dishwashing company that we all know about today, was his partner, and he picked up the patents that he introduced in the early 1920s, which were used as a fumigant against rats and insects and whatnot in grain storage. Bosch converted Haber's process and used it for the war process, and for the war effort, and headed up an organization called IG Farben, which most of you know in this room, invented Zyklon B, which was the gas that was used to kill millions of Jews in the concentration camps. Now, what's fascinating about this is that Bosch took Haber's chemical process to introduce chemical warfare and used it ultimately to kill the Jewish people in the concentration camps. Most of Haber's family, including many of his friends, were killed in the concentration camps using his technology. So I present to you a question, a moral conundrum, which I shared with my congregation. Was he a genius who ended world starvation? Or was he an evil scientist who introduced chemical warfare that killed killed millions and fed billions? Which statement is true? There's a phrase in the Talmud that says the following: the difference between heaven and hell is a handbreadth. That the consequences for our actions one day, which could easily be used for good, can be converted to evil. And on the converse, what we do which may have selfish implications can be converted to good. Let's take a couple of examples. Let's look at the automobile. The automobile was created to make life so much more efficient, yet it is choking the very air we breathe, and we are depleting our natural resources. Let's take plastics, ubiquitous, utterly useful, necessary. I buy something this big at Costco, and I come home with a package this big, all filled with plastic. Obviously to prevent me from stealing it, and 9 times out of 10, I end up cutting my hand trying to open the package. But being that as it may, plastic is polluting the oceans. There are floating islands of plastic in the ocean, some people say as large as Rhode Island. I've even read somewhere as large as Texas, that are destroying our planet. The difference between heaven and hell can be a handbreadth. So Haber may have saved billions, but he killed millions. And I think it is a wonderful metaphor for life. Because when we think about our own lives, even though we are not like Fritz Haber, we are also wonderful and we are flawed. We are noble and we are debased. We lift people up and we drag them down. We empower people and we also infantilize them. This is the starting point of who we are as human beings. I would like to respectfully suggest that while he lived on a grand scale, one way or another, we all are a little bit like Fritz Haber. This past spring, I felt a little tension about that myself. Sometimes we do something good, and maybe it's not so good, and it's at the same time. Let me tell you a little story that took place. It was before Pastor Briggs came here. I attended a gathering at the North Penn Mosque in which members of the Wissahickon Faith Community Association presented a painting that expressed our love and our support for the Muslim community. This took place after the terrible massacre that took place in New Zealand. Many faith leaders, myself included, came to stand shoulder to shoulder with our Muslim brothers and sisters following that brutal attack on the mosque. Now, I was the only yarmulke-wearing Jew in the mosque, and I was proud to be there because I felt standing up to hate and the radical right and white nationalism is an important thing to do. There's a self-interest in it for me because as much as they hate them, they also hate me. But what made it difficult for me was that I was there 2 days after a video became public that was posted up on Facebook of children in a North Penn mosque singing about liberating Jerusalem and killing Jews. And so this became public, and I thought to myself, if I go, am I sending the wrong message, and am I siding with a mosque which, though not directly was involved with that North Penn mosque, was indirectly connected to it? Heaven and hell can be only a handbreadth away. Could my attendance be interpreted as a support of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, which occasionally and sometimes too frequently surfaces in Muslim communities? Or was it a bold statement of solidarity against hate and violence? Like Haber, both statements were true simultaneously. Life can be a very ambiguous journey. We say something to our children with the desire to help them, and we end up realizing maybe we're not being so helpful after all. I'll share with you just a little story in my own personal family life. So I have a son who's a struggling actor in New York. I don't want him to pursue his acting career. I think it's a dead end. My son is not going to make it on CSI LA. Now, my wife and I are trying to gently kind of nudge him to find a different career, right? Because we want, at some point, you're going to have to wake up and smell the coffee, if you will. But I also worry that he doesn't have enough money to make it work. So I'm constantly stooping him money and transferring money into his checking account to kind of help him along. And every time I do that, my wife, Lori, who is far smarter than I, far more disciplined than I, gets mad at me because she says, you're just empowering and enabling this dream, which may or may not become realized. Am I speaking the language you guys understand? Don't we all have that? We all have that tension between, am I helping, am I hurting, am I empowering, or am I infantilizing? Am I enabling, or am I ultimately inhibiting? And so I thought to myself that Haber is a wonderful example of how a person can do incredible good and incredible evil at the very same time. I share with you 3 lessons that I learned from Haber, and I'd love to hear what you think as well, because that's really where I'd love to go with this, because he is relatively unknown, primarily because of his work with chemical warfare. he really should be recognized, because probably the bread we eat is produced with wheat that was fertilized on fertilized soil. But here's a couple of weaknesses that I'd like to point out. Number one, Fritz Haber was an arrogant man. Fritz Haber believed that science, and science alone, could solve all the problems of the world. He was a prideful man, and he never wanted to listen to anyone else's opinion because he knew in his heart that he was right. In fact, his wife tried to dissuade him, and I shared with you earlier on, she ultimately couldn't, and she sadly took her own life. I want to share with you the wisdom of one of my teachers. His name was Daniel Jeremy Silver, a great Reform rabbi in Cleveland. And this is what he writes. He writes about pride. Pride is the enemy of us all. It destroys love, compassion, and ultimately arrogance destroys man himself. For what is life? Is life a broad highway, smooth and easy? No, life is dangerous path along a narrow precipice. And yawning on both sides of the path is death, disease, suffering, financial reverse, and loss. In life, we need support. We need to be tied by many a rope to family and friends so that if we slip, others will shore us up and pull us to safety. But the man of pride walks alone. One by one, he cuts the rope which binds him to his fellow men. And when an ill will blows and he trips, there's no one to pick him up. Daniel Jeremy Silver could have been writing about Fritz Haber. He died alone, in exile. His wife left him. His country left him. And even the starving masses of the world that were fed by him left him. And today he is largely unknown. A man full of himself has no statue, no plaque, no monument. Full of himself, he had no room for anyone else, let alone his conscience. Second, none of us know the exact consequences of our actions when we do them. We hope they'll be for the good, but we can never be certain. All we can do is be true to our core values, our faith, and know the limitations of our vision and seek forgiveness for the unintended hurts and wrongs. Sadly, when we realize that we have not been a blessing, we need to find forgiveness for those imperfections. We pray that God will forgive us for our imperfections, but we also pray that we can forgive others. In my congregational life, I can tell you that I could write a book about the rabbi, not as a spiritual guide, but as a referee between warring members of families. Every Shabbat morning, I have what's called a bar or bat mitzvah. And more often than not, when there's a divorce, and there's another spouse or another girlfriend or boyfriend, I will have to intervene into this quagmire of toxicity and try to work it out so that this small 13-year-old child does not become the whipping boy or girl as these parents duke it out. Sigmund Freud wrote a wonderful essay, and he wrote about, and he calls it, the narcissism of minor differences, in which he writes that sometimes our delicate egos tend to focus on our differences rather than the totality of the entire experience that is hanging in the balance. We feel good when we feel slighted. We feel good when we're wronged. And we feel good when we can hold on to our righteous indignation. Look what she did to me. Look what he did to me. And sometimes that destroys everything. I am blessed sometimes where there's a relationship where they ultimately can come together, and the health of that child difference is palpable when the parents are not constantly warring at each other. I often say when I officiate at a wedding, it's a great line, and I say, it's not my line, the following: if you have an argument, it's okay to become hysterical. Yell, scream, let it out. It's just not okay to become too historical. Let it go. I don't know about you, but I know lots of people, even in my own marriage, something that someone did 20 years ago is still brought up, and you can't get out from underneath it. It is the narcissism of minor differences that ultimately can destroy us. And third, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, he never questioned Fritz Haber, his nationalistic assumptions. He never, at least as I understood it, doubted the surety of his path. He once wrote in his writings, "What does it matter how a soldier dies? Does it matter if they're shot or gassed? Death is death." But it does matter. All is not fair in love and war. The determination of what is right or wrong is not solely based on its utility. The rightness or wrongness of an action is based upon its morality and the faith and the teachings of our tradition. Patriotism or nationalism without a moral compass ultimately led to the demise of both the Weimar Republic and also the Nazi Republic. It ultimately destroyed them both, not once, but twice. Because there was no guide to what was right or wrong. It was okay to exterminate the undesirables. It was okay and it was expedient to gas the trenches. And in the end of the day, the world judged them, thankfully, for wrong. But at the time and at the place, they thought, Haber thought, at least in World War I, that what he was doing was right. Now here's where I'm going to go out on a limb, and I got lots of my own congregants mad at me for saying it when I said it to them. But I'll say it again. Today, patriotism cannot be judged by the degree to which we are following our political leaders. It is not defined by our loyalty to our homeland, but rather to our allegiance to the formative values of our country, like justice, truth, and the rule of law. Determining what is right or wrong in our country is not just blindly following what our politicians are saying, but being true to the Constitution and the ideals that our founding fathers set up for us. Blind nationalism was bad for Germany then, and I believe it's terrible for America today. Utility cannot be the sole criteria for determining what is good. Morality, our principles, our heritage must be factored in. Sadly, in the case of chemical warfare, Haber did what worked, what was efficient, what killed the most with the least amount of German death, but not what was right. And his wife could not abide by his thinking. She took her own life, unwilling to tolerate his blind obedience to the Kaiser. Her decision to end her own life was tragic, but in many ways, I think it was rather noble, because she refused to abandon moral accountability. When we see injustice, however we understand it, we cannot remain silent. We have to open up our voices and speak how we understand the truth to be. A few months ago, I had the joy. I don't know if I would call it a joy, but I went to the Mutter Museum. Any of you been to the Mutter Museum? I didn't get a chance to look at all of the oddities, thankfully. It was just a fundraising, and they opened up a few rooms. But on the main lobby, they had a display of the gas masks of World War I. Any of you remember seeing it? And I'm looking at these terrifying masks, which were grotesque in their shape. They were so dysfunctional. And soldiers who used them, who survived, came out blind, crippled, scarred, burned. They were the walking wounded. And there are all sorts of movies. There's a movie that recently came out where they colorized the video, or actually the film of those soldiers. But it was a tragic thing what happened to them. They rarely worked, and those who survived were permanently disfigured or blind. Gas masks, in my mind, outweigh fertilization. And I think that sometimes when we look at life, we realize, in truth, as my tradition tells us, that the difference between heaven and hell is a handbreadth. Sometimes it's all in our hands. What I said to my congregation, and I'll share it with you, we can never know what will happen as a consequence of our actions today. That is the great mystery. That is the great unknown. But at the same time, we need to think very carefully before we open up our mouths, before we act, before we write a check to our children in New York who are struggling to be hackers. Whatever the issue is in our own lives, ultimately, we learn from Fritz Haber that the difference between heaven and hell is indeed a handbreadth.